We heard in the last session about the small size of the revolutionary socialists in Egypt. I think we should be terribly glad about the very existence of the revolutionary socialists in Egypt by comparison with the stories which the last two speakers gave us. I thought brilliant talks. Because if you look at Poland in 1980, actually I think you need to start in that. There's an article by Chris Harman called The Crisis of the Revolutionary Left, which came out in 1978. And in a sense, Western Europe had very little to offer radicals and revolutionaries in Eastern Europe in 1980. And I think it's very important. If you look at the situation in Poland in 1980, there's this enormous eruption of working class revolt, which leads to a Congress of Solidarity, which calls for a self-governing republic with workers' control of industry. I mean, astonishingly radical ideas, but there is not one, as far as I know, one single clear revolutionary socialist in the whole of Poland. And there's certainly not three of them. I was chatting with Wasim in the break between the meetings. He said in Egypt in 1992 there were 5 of them. That's fantastic to have had 5. They didn't have 5 in Poland. And actually, it matters. It matters a lot whether in fact there is an even small, clear pole of revolutionary Marxist attraction in any country when a crisis erupts, whether somebody is able to say when most of the factories, the major factories in the country are occupied and the government is having to go to the factories and negotiate with them, and the idea of solidarity and of workers' participation is at a peak, and somebody you'd think would raise the slogan, it's a very simple slogan, all power to solidarity. Right? It was never raised. Right? That's an idea, never debated in the movement as an idea. Why? Because there wasn't anybody there to argue it and debate it. And so when we look around the world and we think, oh, we actually happen to know somebody in Iceland. Hooray! I don't know if we do know anybody in Iceland, by the way. It's all my experience of my example of the country that never managed to get a Trotskyist. But it matters very much, the question of minorities and the intellectual influence they can exert, that we actually keep it in our mind all the time when we're meeting people from overseas, that we actually want to draw even the smallest of numbers to our tradition.
I wanted to thank Megan first because I thought it was a really interesting speech and explained a lot of things for me about American strategy and in the Eastern countries. But I just want to underline a couple of points that you made, because I think that the US has a strategy of promoting movements across the globe in the countries where the US identifies those states as being enemy states in any kind at all, and that this isn't just confined to the Eastern countries that you talked about. I mean, this happens in Latin America as well. Maybe Michael will talk about this tomorrow. But clearly the same institutions that you described were very active in Venezuela and other countries, funding, and still are actually, funding opposition movements from below. And it's quite interesting, there's a woman who I don't normally quote, called Eva Gollinger, who actually did a study, yeah I know, I feel the same way, Mike, who is very close to Chavez, sees the world totally through a kind of nationalist, anti-imperialist prism, yeah, just like a lot of Chavistas. But she has studied American intervention in Latin America, and she does have some interesting things to say on it. One thing that she says is that really there was a genuine shift in the 80s in the American state, away from political assassinations and supporting coup attempts through kind of military coups, because they realised that, of course, 25 years later, these secret documents get released, and actually, that a lot of dirt was coming out about what America was doing around the world, and they couldn't continue to do that. And so there was a kind of shift towards the soft power solution that you described. And I think it's important to, if she's right, I think it's important to say, well, this is a strategy which America is adopting in one way or another around the world, and that we do need to kind of factor it in whenever we're analysing revolutions and whenever America is there. Like we've got these debates about Syria at the moment, and I think it's quite easy for us to say, well, this is a genuine revolution. Let's not even bother looking at whether how America is involved. We've got to be really careful with that, because actually, I think within those movements, it's very important that there is a strategy for dealing with attempts by America and other powers, not just America, to kind of subvert those movements. And I think we have to start by recognising that there is a global strategy to try and use these movements for our enemy's favour.
I want to start by adding to the arguments that Gareth put forward as to how to explain the fact that the Velvet Revolution didn't have workers fighting for themselves as a class at the heart of it. By looking at, when he's contrasting with 1953, the revolution in East Germany, which is at a time when state capitalism in East Germany and indeed elsewhere is actually growing fast. It's as an economic model, it is successful. East Germany is actually growing faster than West Germany at that particular point. So the idea that the socialist project could work has a certain material basis to it. The question is, what form does it take, what rights does it give workers, and all the rest of it is what gives workers the confidence, the need and the arguments to fight at that particular moment. But I want to contrast that with what happens then as state capitalism goes into crisis as a model. Is it, in the 50s it's successful, in the 60s it's stuttering, by the 70s it's clearly in crisis, by the 80s it's clearly breaking down drastically. And I'm reminded of being in a factory in Leipzig in January 1990, where the stewards, the people who've actually joined independent trade unions, having been visited by the West German union bureaucrats, whom they recognise as bureaucrats, actually don't have the confidence to present a socialist project as the way forward, and actually are very critical of those leftists who are talking to elements of the old regime in a round table about some kind of reformed East Germany. They can see that the model is breaking down. That point, I would argue, 1989-90, is the high point of neoliberalism. That's the point where it's able to project itself as the model, the only show in town. And Thatcher and Reagan crow about this at that particular moment. Whereas I would argue that 20-something years down the road now, we can actually see a very different situation where neoliberalism, even in the 90s, I would argue, we talked about the joyless boom, that neoliberalism didn't really deliver for most people anything like what it was delivering for the rulers. But having said that, since 2008, it's quite clear what's happening, and in those circumstances, the ideological weight has, the burden, if you like, on putting forward some form of class project in terms of a class for itself, seems to be now much, much more rooted in reality, that people can actually see the class realities. It's a question of what you call it. We call it socialism, and we do get an argument. It seems to me that the revolutionary project, therefore, has an ability to ground itself in the day-to-day experiences of people globally in a way that it didn't have in 1990. I just finished by saying I think one other thinker who sort of identified this was, in a slightly different way, was Boris Kagalitsky in his book The Thinking Reed, where he talked about the way in which the Russian intelligentsia, all the way through the 19th century, right up to 1968, identified one way or another with the socialist project, conceived in whatever way, Tolstoyan socialism or whatever. But nevertheless, it was at that point, 68, when he argues it's the invasion of Czechoslovakia, which is the breaking point. He quotes Solzhenitsyn as somebody who'd seen himself as a Marxist and then become a vile reactionary later on, as an example of somebody who makes that switch. But he argues that it's the whole of the Russian intelligentsia, basically, which makes that transition, basically abandoning the idea of a socialist project. And I think that that's what explains, if you like, across Eastern Europe, why socialist ideas just didn't have any real purchase when it came to the revolutions of 1990.
I'd like to thank Megan again for a fascinating talk, and I want to focus on a couple of things that she said at the end, because I think it's quite important to understand that there's a difference between the grasp the reach of American imperialism and the grasp. In other words, what they would like to do and what they would try to do. It's also, I think, very important to understand there's another fundamental concept in American foreign policy making called blowback, which is when things go spectacularly wrong for them. because something they did turns out to have entirely separate consequences. And I think again that's important. I mean, one quick illustration. We talked about the way that what panned out in Kyrgyzstan. The Kyrgyz government is now one part of an organisation called the Shanghai Cooperation Organisation, which is a pan-Asian, primarily Chinese-led, but with significant cooperation with Russia, attempt to put together an economic and military and political cooperation organisation, essentially based on Asian nationalisms, and thus specifically excluding any idea that the US has anything to say about what happens on the Asian landmass. Now, part of the production of those particular forms of nationalism was part of what the Project for New American Century talked about. As a way of undermining the Soviet Union, we built up Georgian nationalism, we built up Ukrainian nationalism, built up Kazakh nationalism, and that worked because there were very real instances of national oppression behind which you could mobilise people. What you now have, as in, if you like, the dominant, and again, China is a model, the dominant form of government across much of Northern Asia is an authoritarian nationalist government, which part of whose ideology is that American imperialism, because it's not an Asian power, has no place on the continent. And so I think it's important to look concretely at what American imperialism tries to do and what it actually achieves. And that's where I think Syria matters, because I've never seen us write anywhere that we can simply write off Syria's attempts to meddle. If there is a genuine popular revolution anywhere in the world, American imperialism will attempt to intervene in that and will attempt to pervert it to its own ends. The key question for us, I think, is to what extent are they actually managing to do so? Is it the case that they have as some people on the left want to argue, that the entire Syrian revolution is simply being run from Russia, simply being run from Washington, or is it still the case that actually the real power to control things still belongs, by and large, to the armed organisations on the ground in Syria? Our position, my view on the evidence we have so far is the second is actually a closer approximation to the truth than the first. But it comes back to the thing we talked about this morning, about the very concrete analysis of concrete situations, that actually the revolutions will be precisely because of the conditions that have produced particular explosions. The revolutions, even if they are part of a larger overarching movement, nevertheless there will be fundamental differences between the way the process unfolds in one country and the way the process unfolds in another country, and it is important that we look at that. And finally, the last point about this is the idea of the unfolding process, because in none of those countries, in Syria, in Libya, the issue is not fundamentally decided. There is a process that still goes on. It's important for us to look towards what are the possibilities for independent action, rather than simply see the ghost of American imperialism everywhere.
Yeah, anyone who thinks that the US has renounced assassination as a technique of imperial rule hasn't heard of predator drones. But that wasn't what I wanted to talk about. In some ways, what I want to say follows on from what Charlie was talking about. I thought those were two really great presentations, and the combination of this session and the previous session is to give us the two faces of revolutions over the last 20 plus years. And one thing this session does is to give us an opportunity to discuss the role of geopolitics, of the international state system, the rivalries between great powers and so on, in revolutionary processes, because there's a kind of cynical leftist view that would say something like, if you ask than what's the difference between Egypt and Georgia, simply geopolitics. In other words, in the case of Georgia, we have an upheaval in a state that was part of the Soviet Empire. In the case of Egypt, we have an upheaval in a state that was part of the American complex of alliances. And in a sense, that kind of view, which I think, you know, if you read New Left Review and its fairly detached and disparaging view of the Arab revolutions, that's representative of a certain kind of cynical view of revolutions, which generally sees them as what Megan called puppet shows. Now, and I think in this context, the Syrian revolution is very important. It's an anomaly that breaks up these kinds of schemes, because here we have a revolution in a state that geopolitically is aligned against the US, etc. Not a genuine anti-imperialist state, but nevertheless an inconvenience at the very least for the US because of the role that it plays in the peace process and in relation to Iran, but where we have a genuine process of mass struggle. And I really think Luke should, you know, not listen too much to Venezuelan apologists for Chavez, really. I mean, I think that we have to resist very strongly the tendency on the left to treat the colour revolutions as the template through which we look at what's happening in Syria. This is whatever the attempts to intervene from outside, whatever the role of Islamists, and the case of Benghazi should illustrate that, you know, getting Islamists involved in overthrowing your regime you don't like may get your ambassador killed for you. Whatever the efforts to manipulate it from outside, I mean, the levels of mass organisation and sustained struggle are simply not consistent with a view of the revolution in terms of the kind of colour revolutions. And I think that what that means is, when we try to understand what defines a revolution, the most important single criterion has to be the role of mass activity and mass self-organisation. Because if you listen to what Gareth said, we see a weakening impulse of mass activity from 1953 to Poland in the 70s to 1989. And to me, which means that when the Stalinist regimes fall, they fall in a way that simply reinforces the power of the US and extends neoliberal capitalism. And I think the decisive episode here is 1980-81, because the emergence of solidarity indicates that the old regime can't carry on in the same way, that state capitalism is heading towards a fundamental crisis. But the ideological weakness of solidarity that Colin talked about meant that the ruling class won, it defeated solidarity, and that created the space in the country where you'd seen the most sustained working class self-activity, in which we could have a state capitalist transition. So I would say that geopolitics forms an important part of the objective context in which revolutions unfold, and can have all sorts of effects. If we look at some of the complications people were talking about in the previous session about what Palestine and Israel represent, the relationship with Palestine and Israel represent for the Morsi government, and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, it's the dynamic of mass struggle and self-organisation from below that is decisive in determining the character of a political process, whether it's a genuine revolution or not.
I just wanted to make a brief point in connection with what Megan said about the dominant ideology in the area of the Caucasus and Central Asia being that of Stalinism. And just to compare it with an earlier period, if you think historically about how in the years following 1917, actually there was a struggle in that area around the Caucasus and Central Asia, which was a struggle between for example, between Judaism, which was like reformist Muslim organisations, and Bolshevism, and how, because at that moment there was an upsurge in struggle, it was the case that actually the best activists in that area were pulled towards Bolshevik ideas. And what that meant was kind of like developing forces of what was called national communism, and the development of people joining the Bolshevik Party, which isn't to overstate the case, because Central Asia had a weak working class, and historically there had been a certain level of Russian chauvinism by Bolsheviks active in that area. But what you saw happen were attempts to challenge Russification and Russian chauvinism, and also, I'm thinking particularly in the area of women's liberation, how you had an active campaign across the Central Asian area, which included literacy programs, which included childcare, women becoming political activists, and I think you can see how actually, as you know, as Mark said, the dominant ideas inside a society reflect those of ruling forces, and how in a time of upsurge, actually you can see people starting to look towards Bolshevik ideas. And it kind of, you can also see how the extent to which, as the revolution went down to defeat and the spread of Stalinism, you had obscene things happening in those Central Asian countries. So, for example, in Turkmenistan, you had a total cult of personality in the leader of Turkmenistan, who had statues and pictures everywhere. And you really, you know, you had kind of destruction of the idea of fighting against Russian chauvinism, of developing self-activity, developing people's agency, and developing political cadres across those areas. And I think you can see how, in that period, it was also a case of geopolitical questions and of great power rivalries. And I mean, the question that I wanted to ask as well was that, given, if you think about the impact of the Egyptian revolution and revolutions across the Middle East on a global level, is it the case that they've also had an impact on people in the Caucasus and Central Asia who may have been involved in those colour revolutions, but then looking at what neoliberalism has done, have started to question whether the US concept of democracy is the only one that's on offer?
Yeah, I just want to come back to the question of when the turning point was in Eastern Europe. I think it is an interesting argument about 1968 in Russia, the one the comrades mentioned. And I think in terms of the Russian intelligentsia, Kagalowski's probably right. But what's interesting is, if you look at Czechoslovakia in 1968, and some of the transition, the ideas of moving towards non-working class ideas have already happened. There's a very interesting essay by John Berger called Czechoslovakia in Agony, in which he talks about Western British revolutionaries going out to Prague and speaking to revolutionary students. One of them, actually, I think, was probably Harman, and saying, this is what we do in Britain, this is how we organise the party we're trying to build. And being told by the students, have you not read Dostoevsky's The Devils? Do you not know what happens if you try and build this kind of party? You end up with the kind of society that we have here. Which suggests that in intellectual level in Czechoslovakia, people have already moved away from the idea of any kind of working class revolution as an alternative to the Stalinist regime, and are already thinking about Western liberalism as the alternative. Now, in that sense, you can see that in East Germany in 1953 and in Hungary in 1956, the opposition to Stalinism was still posed in working class terms in terms of Soviets and so on. And that's partly due to the kind of memory of earlier struggles and so on feeding through. Time you get to 68, certainly in Czechoslovakia, I'm not sure about the rest of these countries, that's already gone. Well, no longer thinking, and it's not just to do with the crisis of state capitalism, it's actually in a sense that people think this is socialism, we want nothing to do with it. And you've already begun to get a shift towards liberalism, you can see in Havel and so on, as an ideology forming there. Now, Poland, it seems to me to be exceptional in some ways, and Gareth explained why that was, because it was traditions of working class struggle. And it holds out last, even though what you get is a kind of syndicalism, you know, as a kind of ideological weapon used by solidarity, not revolutionary socialism. So in a sense, it happens quite early in the 60s, this abandonment, and again, you read people's views of the Stalinist bureaucracy at the time, the cynicism, the technocratic kind of manipulation that's involved, and the feeling they don't believe there's either, but it's simply what keeps them in power. So it's what I mean. Obviously, 80-81 is decisive in terms of defeat. In terms of ideological shifts, I think it's already happened, at least in Poland. The other thing I wanted to raise was just about, maybe Megan can expand on this a bit, Because the colour revolutions in Central Asia and the external empire of Russia is one thing, but there were also revolutions which in some ways are comparable in Thailand, to a certain extent in the Philippines in the 80s, and Indonesia, which was a genuine upheaval, lots of struggle and strikes and demonstrations and so on, much more genuine than the ones you talked about, and these were in the heart of the America's area of influence anyway. Could you maybe say a bit about that and how these fit into this analysis? Because it seems to be essentially these are the same. At least certainly Taiwan was, as the colour revolutions in Central Asia, but clearly America's attitude towards them is different because it's happening in its backyard rather than the Russian one.
Okay, thanks. Two very interesting talks. I mean, the relationship between the Middle East and Eastern Europe it goes beyond the fact that they're on one level they're just imaginations of Western military planners in terms of regions, but I think there is a quite interesting relationship in terms of how we theorize revolutions, political, social, however we might decide to define them, in the sense that I mean, surely if for us today the Egyptian, the events in Egypt represent the hope for the future, I think the political revolutions, what came out of the political revolutions in Eastern Europe in 1989 is the sort of the other end. I mean, what we're seeing today is really the worst case scenario of what might come out of a revolution in terms of a counter-revolution actually taking place. And I just want to elaborate a little bit about what, in this specific case, about Hungary, because that's the country that I'm looking on most specifically. And in the case of Hungary, I mean, there was a similar sort of political revolution in 1989, and neoliberal programs being implemented in the 90s and the 2000s. But by the middle of the 2000s, this, I mean, neoliberalization of Hungary really starts to show severe signs of crisis. And I mean, as the global crisis hits in 2007, 2008, Hungary is one of the first countries that has to knock on the door of the IMF and ask for a bailout. So on the level of economics, the situation is already bad in 2007, 2008. On the level of politics, the crisis really starts to hit in the last couple of years. And I mean, why I'm saying this is because there is a sort of, we spoke earlier about the space being available within neoliberalism for developing in the future. And as this space is being narrowed down, there is an element, an increasingly authoritarian element coming out, and I think Hungary shows this quite clearly with its current neoconservative government. And I think that is something that we need to take into consideration when we start to compare the situation the current situation in Egypt and so on and so forth with, for instance, things happening in Eastern Europe and so on and so forth. So, thank you.
In a sense, the last comrade brought up part of what I was going to ask you, which is we haven't particularly addressed the question of racism up to this point. When talking about obviously that that conflict between Russia and Georgia, I mean obviously one of the factors was, I mean we talk about it in geopolitical terms, but there was also the local issue, which was obviously that of local nationalism and the way in which that itself is a product of you know, deflections of you know, the absence of kind of a sense that there's need for unity. I mean, you know, interestingly, Conway to kind of look back to 1917 and the way in which there were various kind of revolutionary potential, you know, possibilities in the Caucasus. I mean, obviously one of the interesting things is the way in which, you know, the Stalinist reaction imposed a nationalities policy on that region, which, you know, created things which you know, subsequent movements haven't been able to surpass. I wonder whether we're thinking comparatively about the two kind of waves that two speakers have been talking, Gareth and you've been talking about. I wonder whether there are different, you know, there are different things we see in that term, in those terms, in terms of where we see movements to create unity against kind of temptations or provocations towards racism and nationalism and divisions.
It might be a silly question, but I noticed that when Gareth was talking about the earlier revolutions and uprisings and so on, he didn't mention the Hungarian uprising in 1956, and I wondered if there was any particular reason for that, because I remember having rows with people in the late 1950s, early 1960s, who, when I talked about it, they said, oh, it was a counter-revolution, right-wing, and we don't want anything to do with that.
It's just a quick observation, really. In the past week, I've been reading Donny Gluckstein's new book about the people's history of the Second World War. And I was just really struck by a phrase that Megan said, that it's always very dangerous for imperialist ruling classes to promote revolts, and it's not a new situation particularly. I mean, the Allies during the Second World War in a number of countries did try and establish a relationship with resistance movements, which were very ambiguous and contradictory, and trying to get the most right-wing elements at the head of it that were most likely to be able to be co-opted, but not actually always being able to do that, and in order to get anywhere having to you know, create chaos that didn't always go their way. And in many of the countries, the Allies later found themselves trying to suppress resistance movements that were far more left-wing and had taken advantage of the situation. I mean, also thinking of Libya, where the US did manoeuvre as the repression got more intense there, manoeuvred to try and take over the revolt, and of course in many ways did, and what happened in the end was not a revolution. It was in the end it was a US-backed you know, military assault. But actually there is not a stable US client regime in Libya. There is any number of different fractions from different parts of the previous movement that are in conflict with each other. There have been major protests this week about certain of the militias, and I think it's something that's going to be a constant as long as there are, as long as there is imperialism. They will try and intervene in places, and it won't always go their way. And socialists have to be open to finding, you know, the contradictions in that can be exploited.
I really don't have much to add at all. That wouldn't be a repetition, which I won't do. There were very few direct questions. I think that Nick, towards the end, asked a question about local nationalisms and racisms. I wasn't quite sure what the question was exactly, but it was a fascinating book on the Soviet experience of the fragmentation of the Soviet Union in the 1990s and the social interests that lay behind the formation of new nation states and the whipping up of new nationalisms in those few years, which is by Georgi Delguyan. It's called Bourdieu's Secret Admirer in the Caucasus. That's a good source for that whole debate. I mean, he was a KGB agent for a while, but still, it's a good book. Other than that, I enjoyed the discussion, and thanks to Colin for coming up with the idea for the conference.
On the question of American intervention, I'm not remotely being conspiratorial here. I am well aware of America's role in attempting to overthrow revolts, popular movements, rulers it didn't like, for probably about as long as it's existed. And I'm aware that it spends routinely buckets and buckets and buckets of money intervening in struggles, attempting to shape opposition movements, where and when they come up worldwide, and that is obviously a serious consideration, but I don't think it's not a big surprise, and it certainly wouldn't be something that would shape our attitude in and of itself to those movements. Partly, obviously, I didn't speak about the US strategy more widely, partly because, thank God, I wasn't asked to speak on it. But essentially, I think the reason that I raised it is not to say that what America is doing in the region is radically different from anywhere else, although it is specifically and geopolitically different because of the different situation. But is that there is a difference between America intervening in, to the extent that it can, in opposition movements in, let's say, Venezuela or Egypt, and intervening to largely construct or manufacture movements with the intention of installing pro-US governments. And I think, naturally, we need to argue against the ideology of pro-Western democracy where it comes up in the Venezuelan revolution, in Egypt, and so forth and so on. I'd argue that that's a hell of a lot easier, difficult as it may be, to do in either Latin America or the Middle East, to argue that American democracy may not be what it says that it is, I think is a less difficult argument than it is. You know, context does make a difference, and part of the point about stressing the US strategy in the Caucasus is also to draw attention or to remind of the ideological context within which the States is operating, and those actors in those states are acting. It seems to me that clearly American intervention has a different impact according to several different things: its requirement in the area, what it can potentially get away with vis-a-vis other powers in the area, Russia and China most notably in the cases that I've been discussing, but also, and more crucially really, the depth and the breadth of the revolt on the ground, the balance of class forces, the existence of independent forces that can take on its ideas or its arguments or be won over by its institutions to greater or lesser degree. The tragedy of the Caucasus, and a tragedy that is even more monumental because, you know, it takes place in the former USSR, you know, the site of the only socialist revolution that has thus far been seen, is that precisely because of that past, it has been, or was, much more straightforward for the US to present its version of democracy, its alternative to Stalinist socialism, as the only viable one. And, you know, as other people have pointed out, that, and as Colin said, you know, who'd even be attempting to be an independent socialist in those circumstances? Tremendously difficult to do. So my only argument was really that what they were able to achieve in the area is significantly different than elsewhere. I also think, to pick up on what Neil said, that it is obviously true that partly its attitude towards these revolutions has to do with, you know, whose side are they on. But I think it's more to do with, and I'm not going to talk about Thailand at all, but, you know, Indonesia, for example, I think it's more to do with America attempting to put labels, and in the case of the Philippines and Indonesia and Thailand, retrospectively, to apply the label of colour revolution as a sort of you know, ideological catch-all, as a kind of, look, these revolutions were sort of, you know, safe. They didn't go beyond the bounds to which we were ultimately prepared to be able to deal with, and therefore it serves that purpose for us. I think we have to be really careful of using it. I don't think the term colour revolution serves us in the slightest. I don't think it's one that we should use, apart from to argue against the way that it is used, because I think that way is very problematic. I don't think it is code for a revolution that doesn't amount to socialist revolution, obviously, because, as you said yourself, that's 55 or however Neil's counted. Of course, that's not what I mean. I don't think it's code for revolutions that install pro-US regimes, for that matter. You know, I don't think that's the key. I think what the US has, it seems to me that the central ideological argument to counter is the notion that the colour revolution label has attempted to encapsulate of a bloodless transition from autocracy, authoritarianism, anti-democracy, whatever, to democracy, which is not what you or I or any of the people who are now living in Georgia or the Ukraine or Kyrgyzstan would call democracy. It's not genuine democracy, but it's an attempt to argue that that Western capitalism and its associated ideology is the only option. And I think that's I think it's a travesty when it's applied in the former USSR, but I think it's much more dangerous applied as is attempted to Tunisia, to Egypt, and in retrospect to revolutions that did involve active mass participation. It's an attempt to de-radicalise genuine revolutionary movements, and I think, and to give us instead this sort of pale and bloodless version of it. I think that's it.